Matt Tanner, head of developer relationship at Mosif, and he will be talking about how to get started with your first API monetization. Thanks, Matt.
Hello everyone, welcome to this talk on getting started with API monetization. I firstly want to thank API Days Hong Kong for having me. Very excited to show you some of the stuff that we have going on around API monetization. A little bit about myself. So my name is Matt Tanner. I am head of developer relations at Mosif, and I mainly focus on API first strategy, monetization, and PLG. Lastly, my background is a mix of enterprise knowledge and a love for startups, and API monetization is generally widely applicable in both of those settings. The first thing that I want to talk about is the fact that great API monetization is hard. I think there's a lot of examples out there of APIs being monetized. However, being monetized well is something that is a bit of a tougher task. So there's a few components to great API monetization. The first is developing a pricing strategy. So it's great if you've monetized your APIs, but if the pricing doesn't make sense, then it's going to be very, very tough to sell those APIs. Next is managing API access. So this is something we would generally do with an API management tool or some type of proxy, but making sure that folks can actually access the APIs is also key. Lastly, kind of hand in hand with pricing strategy, we want to make sure that we track usage accurately. No one wants to get a bill for something that they didn't use. So let's make sure that we track things accurately from a customer perspective, and also we want to track it accurately from a business perspective to make sure that we're maximizing our revenue. When it comes to actually building all of that stuff, you're going to need what I'm going to refer to as an API monetization stack. And that's going to have 5 different components that you can look at. First is, and most importantly, is the APIs themselves. The second part of that stack is the sign up or enrollment process. So, a lot of folks will build out stuff with Auth0, with Okta, making sure that people can do self-serve or at least easy enrollment is key. Third is the mechanism for controlling access. Generally, this is going to be API management, but we want to make sure that we are able to provision API keys, that we're able to revoke access and grant access as needed. Fourth, we need to make sure that we have a system of record for tallying usage. And this tends to be one of the tougher components to actually get built into the stack. This is something that we do here at Mosif, actually. And lastly, we have the billing provider itself. So where does this API usage go, and how are customers invoiced? Can they look at invoices? Can they settle any type of dispute? So making sure that you have a billing provider is also key to actually collecting that revenue. So first, let's look at the APIs. Monetized APIs should contain value that users will pay for. So if you have APIs that you want to sell, you obviously need to make sure that there's some type of business advantage to you selling that, or someone actually wants to pay to use it. So that is key. If no one wants to buy it, probably not going to be able to sell it. The second part is delivering value quickly. So you want to make sure that the APIs are easy to use and that what users are spending from a revenue perspective or a cost perspective, they're able to get back very quickly. Obviously, with general business principles, we want to make sure that anytime that a customer is paying for something, that we're actually exceeding the amount of value that they expect. That's the way to keep them upgrading, and it's also a way to keep them on board. Successfully monetized APIs allow for these kind of 3 key things, which are developers have an easy integration. When it comes to how the APIs are charged for, it's easy to understand that payment structure. And lastly, again, most importantly, is it's got to deliver value. So if a monetized API delivers value, you're going to be able to charge for it. And also on top of that, you're going to be able to retain those customers who are using the API. Now for the sign up or enrollment process, this piece here, we want to make sure that it's really the first touch that we're going to have with the customer when it comes to the monetized APIs. So we need to make sure of a few things here and a few different factors. First, it needs to be straightforward and accessible. You need to make sure that We don't have to fill out a whole bunch of fields that we don't need to fill out, that the checkout process is easy to facilitate. All these types of things need to be really well honed. So that also comes to point number 2, which is ask for enough information, but not too much. You don't need them to fill out, their entire life story. Just get the bare minimum that you need. And if you need more info, you can ask for that after or make it optional. But again, you want to make sure that you don't have like 5 mandatory fields and then 50 optional fields. It also makes it look very confusing. 3, we want to make sure that we collect the payment method at this point. So we want to make sure that we collect a credit card or somewhere we're able to actually charge for that usage. It's easier to do it at this point. And lastly, you might want to think about having or not having a free trial for these APIs or a free tier for these APIs. Sometimes certain product experts will actually say that the free trial motion is not to your advantage. However, if you do have an API where a free trial would allow people to use the API, get value really, really quickly, and then come on board as a paying customer, this might be a great way to do it. Now, as part of that, you want to make sure that you're tracking your signup flow to enhance the conversions that you're having. So as you can see in this chart here, we have first bar is page visits, then we have how long and how many people do a sign up, then how many make a first API call, and then how many have recurring API calls. And that's where you really start to get some of that revenue bumping up. So you want to make sure that the entire process is really honed in and enhanced. So if you find that people are coming to the sign up page and then dropping off, or they're making their first API call but aren't making recurring API calls after that, then that gives you a place to focus and improve. This is really important for trying to build as much revenue as possible and making sure that users can actually leverage your APIs that you've monetized. In an ideal world, we obviously know that self-service is kind of the way to go. Click through terms of service. We have faster integration because there's not a bunch of hoops to go through in order to get, signed up and ready to go. And then you can also do payment via credit card, which can be a lot easier and more predictable than if you have to invoice and collect or have transfers happen to you manually. So what you might want to do when you're talking about your pricing tiers and when people are signing up is actually figure out what payment options you want to give during enrollment. So you might have a prepaid versus postpaid scheme, tiered versus per call pricing. You might give volume discounts, or you might also be able to space out when the invoice interval is. Maybe you want it to be based on a threshold, maybe you want it to be monthly, quarterly, yearly. All of that stuff you can try and get dialed in during the enrollment phase. Obviously, you can have it so they can change it later, but this is a good way for them to see what plans and what options you have available. So I'll very briefly go through each of these. If you want, you can pause this or chat with me later about these different billing strategies. So you either want to do prepaid, which is I'm paying a certain amount and I'm going to burn through those credits or through those dollars, or postpaid, where usage is tallied over the certain period and then invoiced at the end of that period. Obviously, you can see there's pros and cons to each, and I'll let you go through those on your own. But prepaid tends to be a little more advanced to implement because you have to have mechanisms in place that stop users from using the APIs if they burn through all their credits, and those types of things. It also means that there's some upfront cost because they're going to need to put credits on before they've really tried it out. So there could be some friction there. For postpaid, it tends to be a little bit easier. However, from a business perspective, it does make things where people could bump up their usage quite high, and then when the invoice comes, they might not pay it. So it's more of a business decision than a technical decision. However, there are technical consequences and advantages to each of these. Next is your packaging strategy. So are you going to do tiered pricing where you charge this much for this, that much for this, and then so on and so forth? Or are you just going to charge for every single call that comes through? Every single call is considered a unit of usage. The great part about tiered pricing is, as you can see here, which really is the standout one, enforces a minimum spend. So if your plan started at $100, you know that that customer has to spend a minimum of $100. Per call pricing if you're only charging, let's say, $1 per call because it's a really high value API, well, they would have to do 100 calls in order to match that first. So it could be a great way to get some initial revenue there. However, there's an advantage to per call pricing too, which is it's a lot more efficient for customers because they're only paying for what they use. And there's less friction in expansion. And what that means is, from a tiered pricing perspective, if I have a tier at $100, then $500, and then let's say $2,000, that means that when they're on the $100 tier, in order to upgrade them to $500, which is 5 times more money per month, I have to add a lot more value. Whereas if users continue with a per call pricing and they scale up their usage, it's since they're getting charged per use, they don't necessarily hold back on that expansion. So it just kind of naturally progresses. The big thing with per call pricing though is it can lead to sticker shock for some customers. So if they've been using the API and not really paying attention, and let's say they're doing postpaid, at the end of the month, they might see, wow, we've made 1,000 calls to that API, or we've made 1 million or 1 billion calls to that API, and here's our massive bill. Versus tiered pricing usually has some type of enforcement for that quota. However, you could still do that at per call pricing as well. So lots of different factors to take into consideration here. Invoicing strategy is another one that you can usually tweak, which is you can have recurring, so every month they're going to get an invoice, or you might have a threshold one. So many of you have probably seen this in AWS and other cloud providers, where you can say, when I reach $200 in spend, I want to be invoiced. You can do that as well. Either of them will work. They all have different pros and cons, as you can see listed here. And that's kind of the 3 pillars in terms of actually charging and invoicing for these APIs. Next, we'll move on to controlling access through API management. So what does API management actually offer us when it comes to API monetization? Well, in general, API management helps us with securing APIs, makes it very easy to secure a portfolio of APIs with a really uniform way of adding those application security for authorization and authentication. It also allows us to really easily productize APIs. So a lot of times, a lot of the API management solutions will have things in place where you can easily productize APIs and group them together. Lastly, it allows us to collect API metrics. So most API gateways and proxies are going to have some type of architecture that allows you to either take event data and push it into other platforms such as Mosif, or it could also have something internally where you're able to see each of those metrics just natively within that platform. Like I already mentioned, API management adds security and authorization. It adds user management, not just for internal users, but also for external users. Some platforms will also allow you to enforce data governance. So if someone has a specific role, they're only allowed to see these specific fields in the API. You can do that type of stuff. And then another nice thing is that many of them offer a developer portal, which is key to monetizing your APIs and making it easy for developers to access those and generate tokens and sign up. Once we've got our APIs in place, we've got them hooked up through API management, our next piece is to somehow tally usage records. So we need to figure out how much is being used of these APIs and being able to dial in exactly what a successful monetized API call looks like. So the system used to create these usage records, at a minimum, should create accurate usage records. And that should be in bold, bold, bold. Because if you don't accurately get these usage records documented, let's say they're too high or too low. Too high, you're going to make the customer upset or the user upset. Too low, and you're actually taking away from some of that revenue that you could be driving. So making sure that that is accurate is very, very key to this. And then, depending on whether you're doing postpaid or prepaid, making sure that timely reporting is happening when it sends that data to the billing provider. If you're doing prepaid, you want it to be very, very quick because you'll need to be able to see how many credits they have left versus the API calls that they're making. And for postpaid, you still want to make sure that over the month you can see how that data is coming into the platform and being recorded by that billing provider. On top of those basics, the best solutions for this also do a few other things. One of them is providing support for various metrics to bill upon. So you don't just want to say, every time someone calls this API, I want to bill them. You might want to say, every time that someone calls this API and receives back a 200 response and has a minimum count of 4 in the request body, I want to monetize that. Anything other than that is either free or is not successful, so I don't want to charge upon that. So being able to do that type of stuff very flexibly allows you to do a lot more use cases versus charging for every call regardless of what happens. Another thing is allowing for business users to access the platform. So you want to be able to show maybe billing metrics, be able to have business users look at charts for predicted revenue, these types of things. So making sure that you have that stuff in place so that the technical people can focus on making sure that things are built correctly, and the business folks can make sure that the APIs are performing the way that they expect when it comes to generating revenue. Lastly, you want to make sure that you're able to easily audit these usage records. If a customer comes back with a discrepancy, you want to be able to make sure that you can go back through their usage records and easily audit it to see if it's a mistake on their side or a mistake on your side. Lastly, you want to look at choosing a billing provider. There's tons of billing providers out there. Depending on what system you're using to tally up the usage will dictate which ones you can use. A few of the more popular ones that you've probably heard of are Stripe, Chargebee, Recurly. Stripe tends to be the one that a lot of folks go for these days, but there are alternatives out there with advantages as well. What you want to make sure is that when you're choosing the billing provider, does it have existing integrations with other platforms? So if you're using another platform, does the billing provider integrate with it? Maybe you want to bring sales data over into Snowflake or into Salesforce or something like that. Does it have those types of integrations? Next is, what type of pricing schemes does it support? So are you able to do discounts? Are you able to do tiered pricing, per call pricing, these types of things? You want to make sure that that type of billing is possible with the billing provider. My biggest thing would probably be this third one, which is it easy to work with? We don't, as technical people, we don't want to spend hours in a billing provider to set up things that should be really easy for us to do. So making sure that you pick one with a good user interface and a lot of functionality, and in Stripe's case, really, really good APIs. You want to make sure that it's easy to work with so that you can spend the least amount of time in it, but get the value you need out of it. And lastly, you want to make sure that you have support for billing issues and auditing. Is it easy to audit? And if you do have some type of discrepancy, can you easily reach out to support? That would be key, as many times when you do have an issue with overbilling or underbilling, you need to get that rectified quickly and figure out what the root cause was. So like I said, here's a couple examples of billing providers that you might want to look at, which would be Stripe, Recurly, and Chargebee. There's tons more, and most platforms are going to support them in some way, shape, or form, but these are 3 that we see a lot of our customers use, and many of them are very easy to get up and running and be billing customers for API usage in a matter of minutes to hours. The last thing I want to talk about is when you're trying to build out the architecture for these monetization solutions. So at Mosif, what we do is we provide that layer that allows you to tally up the usage. So as you can see on the left-hand side, these are your APIs, these are your apps. The API usage actually gets funneled into Mosif, where it can then be tallied up and then passed over to Stripe, Recurly, or Chargebee so that the user can be invoiced. This is generally something that folks used to build in-house, and it was very tough to scale it out, and it took a long time to build. And the other issue was maintaining it all. we've wrapped that up into a little SaaS platform. So just a slight little plug here, as we're just trying to allow people to understand that a lot of this has already been solved within the MoSIF platform. So if you've got APIs, API management, and a billing provider and need to kind of glue it all together, this is one of the most flexible solutions that you're going to come across. And with that, that is the end of my presentation on getting started with API monetization. Feel free to contact me at matthew@mosif.com if you do have any questions, or you can catch me in the platform networking areas. Again, thank you to API Days Hong Kong for having me. It's been a pleasure. And with that, I will pass the mic back to the MC, and thank you very much for joining this talk.
Okay, thanks for joining the API Days Day 2 today. So that's the end of all of the sections.
The API Connect Hong Kong 2023 conference is powered by bNovelty Limited. Check out more API-related education content on bnovelty.com or apidays.hk for more information.